In the intro, Harry referred to ethnography as expensive but effective. And Miles, you talked really eloquently about a rapid ethnography project which took 6 weeks. One of the things I remember most about usability becoming sort of popularised was Jacob Nielsen talking about discount usability. The idea that you could do this stuff really, or a lot of this stuff really, really quickly and cheaply and see a lot of benefits. Yep. Is there an equivalent discount of ethnography? Are there some things that you can do in days rather than weeks to get some of the benefits of this stuff?
Yeah, definitely. I think, obviously in this case it was difficult because we're dealing with people on the other side of the world, but we've looked at some situations with that where we said, well, hang on, let's use expats that are living in the locations where we've got offices so that we can still get some cultural insights into those other locations, those other cultures, but without having to fly people over there, send researchers out and deal with translation issues and whatnot. So that's a good example of where you can sort of say, well, okay, yes, you're not going to get the same depth of insight, but it might answer most of the questions you've got, or at least help you identify further questions that you need answered during the design process. I think, for local projects, often it's just a matter of sitting down with people. I think, the stuff that Flo were doing for the Environment Agency is a good example, but again, you don't have to sit up there for 2 weeks in a hotel on the seaside. Even just going and spending an afternoon with 1 or 2 people and looking at how the stuff that you do interfaces into their lives can be really, really insightful. I think in particular, this barrow that obviously I like to push, people have been doing a lot of talk about, let's talk about mobile design and all this sort of stuff. And in my opinion, there's almost no such thing anymore. That everything people are designing on the web, software applications for PCs and so on, is effectively mobile now anyway. But so many people are using mobile devices to access things that you really need to look at things in a mobile context. So yes, I think you can do discount ethnography in a way, but the way that I've found it most useful is in narrowing down the sort of questions that we need answered. I don't think I've used that in a project where it's been the only research input. I suppose the other approach, which I've used on this project and some others, is also, we're lucky because we've got a library of research that we can go back on, is to look at other research and look at what insights we can grab from that. Yes, looking at the PowerPoints isn't as useful, but you can still gain some useful insights. I believe Adaptive Path are looking at releasing some research that they've done in India in late last year under a Creative Commons license, and that's dealing with emerging markets with rural India. That I think is going to be a really interesting opportunity because they're just putting the research out there and saying, do what you like with it. We're keen to see some results from this. So I think they're looking at doing that in the next month or 2.
You're saying that you're doing ethnography. How are you jumping off the veranda? As Malinowski said, okay, jumping off the veranda was before Malinowski came up with the idea of ethnography. The idea was what people did was drove out to a village, spent a week there, drove away. They'll probably spend their time in a very kind of expensive marquee with servants serving them, which kind of like in your Nigerian experience kind of said that the guy was staying in a 5-star hotel, he wasn't living with the people, he wasn't participating with the people. Is this really ethnography, or is this just another form of research dressed up as ethnography?
I think you could argue either of those two things. I think you could argue it's ethnography. I think you could argue it's design research dressed up as ethnography. I think it depends on how strict you want to be in terms of definitions. Certainly in terms of the research we've done, this would probably be middle of the scale in terms of the ethnographic stuff we've done. I think the far end of the scale, there was some work that was done a couple of years ago by Jan Chipchase and a couple of other people in my team that was looking at slums. And they went to different slums around the world and spent 2 weeks living in the slum. Okay. That's more like jumping off the veranda. Yeah. They didn't tell corporate security, I don't think, but but yeah, and there's lots of challenges as a result of that. That frankly, most Western people aren't built for living in slums, and you've got lots of risk of disease and all sorts of things. And one of the people I've done research with in the past year, got very, very ill with an unknown virus, malaria type virus last year. So, so there's limitations to that, but I think there's also limitations in terms of how people will let you into their lives. It's very hard to actually get people to engage with you and let them into their lives for that period of time. And so it's a little bit of a trade-off as to what realistically you can do with the sorts of people you're after, in terms of how they'll do it. And plenty of times we've had situations where we show up, start doing things, and people just say, look, I'm not comfortable with this, and we just have to pull the plug. And so there's lots of trade-offs like that you have to make. Does that
yeah,
yeah.
It's an answer, and I mean, there's a lot of things like in Ghana with mobile phones, and in Nigeria, there's the whole thing of flashing, where people don't make phone calls, and there's a whole thing that actually take a while to actually learn. And I mean, unless you guys discovered that in a week, or
well, I mean, there's a couple of ways we do that. I mean, one is to look at the past research that's been done in the area where we've been. And the other is to work, where we can, work with local researchers, not flying researchers from London to Nigeria, but actually working with people that have got an office in Nigeria, that live there, that understand the community, that have ideally been brought up there. So when I was in Cairo, I was working with people that had spent their whole lives in Cairo, grown up there, and so I could get quite deep insights into that. But there's a limit. I mean, language issues are another one. I don't speak Arabic. Or any of the languages in India other than English. So there's a limit to the sort of understanding in-depth sort of stuff you can get. So sorry, Tim.
Okay, so talking of language, there's been sort of like several comments about whether this is ethnography or not. Is it that we call it ethnography because that's the closest sort of term we have? Or is there a different term that should get popularised? Does that question make sense?
Yeah. Good question. I mean, when I was saying, it's a form of design research, I don't think there's necessarily a word or words in design research that sort of describe that stuff well enough. And ethnography really is a field, and I think really can occur on a scale of things. It's really any research that goes out to look at, to be with people in situ, is really a form of ethnography to me. The depth to which you go will sort of determine how close it gets to traditional academic ethnography, I suppose.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello. I think part of that question, I think one of the benefits of using the term ethnography, or personally don't feel comfortable for the same reason, is that it sells it better than the notion of field research. It sounds more important, it's grammar, which is an important thing for those of us who work with agencies. But also on top of that, it's very expensive, like you say, to get empathy, and empathy is important. Does Nokia have any sort of plans, or do you have any plans to sort of leak out any return on investment details about this? Are you under obligation to create that kind of information?
I'm just thinking what I can say. I think one of the nice things about working with emerging markets is scale, and so compared to say some fairly narrow areas of research that I've done in the past, where the return on investment needs to be much greater, you don't have to have a huge return on investment for an individual service or an individual customer if that's going to, in a sense, have this multiplication across huge markets. So yes, we do have to sort of draw things back to what the impact's going to be on the business, obviously. But in terms of specific, design decisions and what the impact of that is, that's not something I've done much work on. There has been some stuff talked about, like for example, there's the classic story about how the torch got put in the Nokia 1100, I think, which Don Norman didn't really like. He thought we should have just asked him. And then much easier, to be honest, I think it was probably cheaper to go to China and just do the research there. And that particular model, that was a key differentiator for that model, and that went on to sell 200 million devices. So that's an example of where there's clearly been a return on investment from an understanding that we gain through doing that sort of research. But yeah, it is definitely a difficult thing to try and sell in that sense. I think what we're finding is that we're trying to be cleverer with how we spend our money at the moment, and so things like working with expats for certain things has been something that's worked quite well. We're investigating, can you work with tourists, people that are visiting from another country, what sort of insights do you get, what sort of limitations are there with that? Obviously mining sort of the huge vault of research that we've had in the past. So I think internally there's definitely a need to justify the value of the research, but there's also an understanding that you can't design in isolation. And so the type of research you do will vary from project to project, but you need to have a research component that's essential.
I was just wondering, why is Nokia going out to the poor, if you like? Obviously, one wants to find a market which has money, and if they don't have much money, if you stay, what's the reason behind it?
I think ultimately again, opinions being expressed to my own and not necessarily those of Nokia. I think there's a shift in the mobile market away from hardware and towards software, services, and ultimately solutions. And I think there's an understanding that that's likely to happen in emerging markets as it's started to happen in developing markets. And so really it's just looking at, well, okay, people have got the hunks of metal and plastic in their hand. How are we going to deliver value beyond that? How are we going to actually remain competitive in a market where it's getting cheaper and cheaper to make those hunks of plastic and metal? And although we've got quite strong market share in many of those regions, there's no guarantee that that'll happen forever. And so I think it's looking at ways in which we can engage with people beyond phone calls, beyond text messages, and still provide them with some value. I think you see that in Western markets in different ways, probably more heavily focused on the entertainment side rather than agriculture. But I think there's still that looking at mobile devices as a delivery channel for information, and information that people can use to make decisions and essentially make, ideally, better decisions. That'll mean better results for them.
Developing countries contain the most people in the whole world.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, India's
you've got numbers at least.
1.2 billion, 1.3, something like that. I mean, the US and Europe and most of the OECD countries combined is less than 1 billion, well under 1 billion. So there's volume there definitely, but some of the challenges of things like infrastructure and so on are big issues. There was a guy in one of the countries that first thing he did when he woke up was pick up his phone and call his assistant that sort of went in and opened up his shop and just asked, is there any power today? And if there was no power, he stayed in bed. If there was, he'd get up and go to work. So those sorts of challenges are big issues compared to sort of what we take for granted in developed sort of markets.
Could you move your whole team to Nigeria or to India to design a product?
For this case, no. But I mean, there has been some. Sorry.
Do you want to ask the question again? Shall I ask it again? Yeah. Okay. Could you move your whole team to Nigeria or Ghana or Egypt to develop a product?
There's a couple of ways that I think that's been done in the past. I mean, Nokia Research has got facilities in different places. There's a new Nokia Research facility that's opened in Kenya, for example. And designers have done work in the past in India with universities, and in Brazil I think with universities as well. For some projects that sort of thing happens, that perhaps not in the early stages of design, but when you're actually at the stage where you're doing sort of like user testing sessions and working in a fairly agile way, often you'll have the designer working there because it just makes sense to have them co-located in that space. They can understand so much more about that place, but it also means that you can just turn around things so quickly. Being in a range of different locations is difficult with an agile team. So getting everyone in the same room is a much better way of doing it. Would I like to do that for design projects? I think For this sort of thing, it's difficult. One of the things that I noticed was that a lot of the team that were working on the project were based in India. And so although the research had been conducted across the world, we found that a lot of the decision making perhaps was, inadvertently favouring India in some ways, favouring an Indian interpretation of the data and an Indian solution. And so, we highlighted that and we sort of addressed it, but that's one of the problems where you're designing for a broad range of audiences is, in a sense, in some ways you're actually better off being outside of that environment so that you're reflecting the research and so on more evenly.
Time for one more question.
I think there was one in the middle here that was, yeah.
Have you got any sense of being involved in this research, if it has actually changed your perception of Ames mobile phone and how it's really used? Has your involvement altered your own understandings?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a good example. I think one of the things that surprised me was the way that people just treated mobile phones as another tool. There was a fisherman that we worked with that just routinely dropped his phone into the water. But he'd go in and fish it out. He'd dive under his boat, go and grab the phone and bring it back. And he'd done this about 10, 12 times. And the key map was just like back to raw plastic and everything else. And he just said, yeah, just take the battery out, go and sit it over here in the sun and it dries out and then it'll be fine the next day. So despite the fact that phones are relatively expensive to people, they're not very precious with them. In the same way that I think in many ways you'd see people being precious with phones. In developed markets. One of the other things that I found through this project was looking at people's mental models of digital space, and something that I noticed there was that understanding hierarchies which were quite deep appeared more difficult for people in emerging markets that had no experience with that, that wider and shallower hierarchies was something that seemed to work better with. And I think that's probably just a matter of experience and practice, but that was quite an interesting insight that changed some of the ways that we approached the design, and obviously a whole heap of issues related to literacy and memorability of paths and all that sort of stuff. But that's another example. So yeah, I think it did. But in terms of the core sort of behaviour, in terms of calls and texting, I think beyond some of the sort of the flashing in African countries and some of the operator innovations around being able to send free texts of different types and so on. Not a huge amount, but it wasn't a core aspect of the work that I was doing.